Now you can hear me. Oh, yes, you can hear me now. Brilliant. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Hello, beautiful community. We may just have a casual chat in and around the stuff that we raised in the main channel video. And that just is really about the fact that you can't have a conversation about where the world's going and what we can do about it unless we have a conversation about what's going on at home. That was at least one of the themes of that video. I'm extremely grateful for the positive reception of it. I think a lot of people really were very generous in feeling that the video clarified some things or provoked some things for them. So I'm enormously grateful about that. And this is on the main channel, the third of the last 4 videos that ran into a problem. 2 of the last 4 videos on the main channel got an age restriction, and I appealed both times and won. But by the time that you have an appeal decided upon, the video's sort of dead, and it's hard to recover it. And yesterday's restriction was much milder. It wasn't an age restriction, but it just taps off maybe 30+% of the views, maybe a bit more. And I won that appeal too, I'm delighted to say. But 3 out of 4, especially as I upload so rarely, is not a good hit rate for videos running into trouble. And this is far from being the most tricky thing about this platform, which offers us so many possibilities. But it's one of them. And I suppose the really, really tricky part is the fact that over every political YouTube channel, there does hang a kind of question mark, because the process through which it might be taken off or might disappear is untransparent and essentially unappealable. So, what would happen if somebody in our algorithmic bubble, for some bizarre reason, lost their YouTube channel? Well, not much. What would happen would be, let's say Jake Bro lost his YouTube channel. I mean, fingers crossed, we're talking fantasy here. Well, then, me and Arthur Ray and lots of other people in our algorithmic bubble, maybe Times Radio too, could make a fuss about it. And then we'd get some better known people to make a fuss about it, probably on Twitter or on X, whatever it's called now. And then there might be an outcome, there might not be an outcome. And of course, that in itself is a kind of strange democratic deficit. The precarity of this, it's never a physical precarity. Nobody's going to, come for a YouTuber like I often come for Ricky. But, physical danger apart, there is a precarity about this platform. And, it is a little bit like broadcasting from an unstable region of the world, whereby you are here today, but you're not, 100% sure if you're going to be gone tomorrow. And I think what's worth emphasizing is that this platform has two levels to it when we express admiration about things done on this platform. There is mastery of the platform itself, and then there is also mastery of your thing, whatever it is you're doing, whether you're repairing furniture or whether you are doing human rights lectures, whether you're talking about the biggest political and cultural issues as we are, with a focus on the region. Um, and these two aren't the same skill. And that's why I have so much admiration for people who do very skillful things on YouTube, whether they are um, mm, on top of that also skillful in that second dimension. Um, that dimension of being very good at um, not just YouTube, but the particular topic, the particular subject you're dealing with. Um, and what I'm trying to say is, even an entertainment channel on YouTube, let's say one that covers politics through entertainment, which I try not to do, um, is really an incredibly hard thing to build, and it takes luck and it takes certain kinds of craft. Um, and what I'm saying is, how do you value that as a resource if you lose it arbitrarily, or if the culture loses it arbitrarily? And it seems to me that it's um, enormously valuable. I mean, let's just take a trivial example. Imagine that, let's say, Jake Bro, who, you know, Jake and I are doing very different things, but we're very much in the same algorithmic niche. But imagine if Jake suddenly woke up and forgot all the financial advice he is expert on, and he came to me and he said, "Vlad, um, an evil monster came and ate and offered me a very dangerous deal, offered to buy my YouTube channel. Um, how much shall I sell for?" So it's a channel that's probably approaching 500,000 followers. Follow counts don't matter much these days, so just look at the repeat views if you want to evaluate the channel. Um, if somebody said to me, if Jake said to me, $500,000 shall I sell? I'd obviously say that's utterly insane. If it was $1,000,000, would I say sell? No, I think a million is far too low for a platform like that. Far too low. So you see what kind of ballpark we're getting into. You can't quite put put a financial value of it, but you're essentially talking about a local radio station, a regional radio station potentially. And so there is no other part of society where a thing like this can just evaporate without the capacity to appeal, without the capacity for any due process. So it's a kind of environment that every single person who talks about anything remotely controversial um, uh, on this platform always has at the back of their minds. And that is why, for example, a lot of people told me that I'm utterly out of my mind at this stage of growing my platform to completely openly discuss with heat the Israel-Palestine issue, which of course I'm not open to not discussing. But that's this kind of very interesting reality. But I've just talked about the craft of YouTube. There's also the craft of one's craft, which in my case is 95% of what I do. My YouTube craft is crap. And what's interesting here is that if you're going to do something that's absolutely not activism or entertainment, you're putting yourself in a very difficult position automatically with the algorithm, because the algorithm wants you to find an audience that wants to hear what you want to say and say more of it and say it with greater intensity. And you see already how this conversation is becoming much less narcissistic now, because we're talking just flatly now about our information environment. And so what one is trying to do is sit here and not give you guys cliches, not give you guys stuff you want to hear, even though the truth is that the people in this tiny room, how many of us are here? It's 400 of us. The people in this tiny room probably don't want to hear what you already think, but that's not going to be true of the returning audience to the two channels taken as a whole, right? So, but you can't do that. You can't, as a public intellectual, tell people what you want to hear. And so what you have to do is build trust so that you feel that your life can go better if, as I put it in a tweet today, if you buy an interpretation from me, right? So we have to build a kind of trust that you feel that your life will go better if you buy an interpretation from me about what's going on in the world. You're going to buy it with your time, really, um, which is an incredible gift in this world of stress and busyness and fear and, of course, also excess of information resources. And that's precisely what the algorithm doesn't want me to do. It just doesn't want me to do that. It wants me to tell you what you already think, but with more ferocity and with more intensity. And it wants me to go after your opponents. Let's say the people who don't support Ukraine enough, for example. And of course, ethically, I can't do that. There's always, strangely, this process of, on the one hand, YouTube craft, on the other hand, the craft of the public intellectual, and then the craft of a public intellectual who is trying to be on YouTube um, in a way that dances constructively with the algorithm, while much of the time trying to sort of trick the algorithm. Because the algorithm knows exactly where it wants to go. It wants you to receive more of what you already think. It wants you to consume the thing you most readily want. So it wants you to get your ice cream. It doesn't want you to get your newspaper, if you like. It doesn't want you to get your book, because you're going to want the ice cream more readily. And you're gonna want the ice cream um, more consistently, whatever time of the day the ice cream finds you, than a particular kind of book that you need to be in a particular kind of mood to read, and so on. So anyway, so it's in that light that, of course, it's particularly frustrating to work for a month. I'm sick, so a month in my time. So if I were well, this could be a week. But to work for a month on a video, and then have it, like several previous videos, struggle in the algorithm. But as I say, that is all extremely minor stuff relative to the big deal of YouTube craft plus public intellectual ethic being reconciled, and the other big deal of all of us, of course, staying on this platform and not losing our way, which is why you're going to see something soon from me, which is little moves to connect us on YouTube more deeply, but also off YouTube. So now I have lots of questions that I've just missed. I also have a question, I think, that Sebastian left, which is, while it was waiting, can a Western politician actually state that there are no permanent fields of pumpkins and sunflowers and sunlit uplands? Or does he have to sell the idea that they're just around the corner? So I do think that an element of fabricated hope is essential in politics, even when there isn't hope, which is why politics is not a business for people who are sacredly ethical. No sacredly ethical person could ever be a leader of a major country. You could be a leader of a local council and reduce your speed limits to have fewer kids run over. Something like that is totally doable. But you can't be president even of a medium country without all hell breaking loose on your ethical track record. And so we judge big leaders not by whether they avoid doing horrendous things, but whether they keep their ethical compass while sometimes doing horrendous things. Now, and I mean that, and that's not a criticism. It's ethical admiration. So what we're looking for is ethical adequacy from leaders, not ethical sacredness. But one of the issues is, of course, that politicians cannot be robustly truthful at all times. On the one hand, on the other hand, they mustn't lie excessively, and they should only lie directly in very rare contexts. And also, they should never descend into what I call post-truth politics, which is far worse than lying, because that's the kind of deliberately incoherent discourse that degrades not your belief that a particular fact is true, but your belief that there's a difference between true and false facts. And that's why I am so jumpy when it comes to post-truth politicians, because they are not liars. They're much, much worse than liars. And liar politicians are a dramatic upgrade on post-truth politicians, because post-truth politicians don't mislead us on issues. They mislead us around our stability of continuing to have confidence that there is a difference between getting an issue right and getting an issue wrong at the level of facts even. Now, so fabrication, some degree of fabrication is ethically going to get a tick from us. And it's just going to be a conversation about what kind of fabrication it is. Now, what I think a politician does need to do is tell people the truth about where we are, a bit like our video did yesterday. Now, Joe Biden tried to do something similar to what I said in that video. It's just that it's completely inconsistent with everything else he says. It's inconsistent with many things he does. He knows that, and he knows he can't change that. So these are difficult waters, and these are not easy things for politicians to say or do. But I do think that people are incredibly uneasy and incredibly scared at the moment about not so much bad things happening in the world, which we're all witnessing, but actually things getting worse and things not making sense. We're scared of things getting worse because deep down, that teleological story that I probably emphasized more than ever in yesterday's video is still part of our thought, right? Teleology dies slowly. And the idea that future generations won't necessarily live in a better world, except maybe for medical progress and limited things like that, won't necessarily live in a better world than us, in better societies than us. It's utterly obvious to anybody who studies history, because it goes like this. But to us, it's hard to fathom. It's hard to process. It just doesn't feel right. So the idea of progress being a bit broken is hard to internalize. And then, of course, there is this business of things not making sense. Why have we got so much polarization? Why have we got so many distinct mental worlds that we're breaking up into, and distinct fact world? Why is this happening? Why is the quality of politicians degrading? So people are scared. So you need to tell people something that reassures them that you're not blind to that you're on top of it. Otherwise, people are just going to feel scared. They're just going to feel scared even more than if you don't mention it. But at the same time, you have to emphasize to people that you can make progress in some domains, and that you can make certain issues go a lot better, and that you can do a lot better than others at averting the worst outcomes. So I think you can be passionate. The problem, basically, in answer to your question, this is the last thing I'm going to say, is that you're going to have a politician who blends um, incompatible demands, including the increasingly incompatible demands between being in office and doing things and getting elected. Increasingly in our world, the two are incompatible. What you need to get elected is increasingly incompatible with what you need to do in office and what qualities you need to do to have in office. You know, um, and you have figures like Vivek in the United States, who is very gifted at the process of getting elected at the level that he's not going to get. He's going to get some traction. Obviously, he's not going to be the president, but he's going to get some traction. But he's a zero as a functional politician, worse than a zero even. So we're getting that gap. And we now have a generation of politicians who are proud of the fact that they are just doing that. They're not focused on being good politicians. They're focused on being good at getting in. And what I think is going to be central, and this is really the final point I'm making here, to the answer to your question, Sebastian, is that that politician is going to have to balance being good on issues versus preserving democracy, because now increasingly there is a clash between taking good steps on issues and these good steps causing more toxicity in your society and more polarization and more divisiveness. And you're stuck between a rock and a hard place because no issue can be worked through unless it goes through our democratic institutions. But at the same time, getting issues um, uh, practically moving undermines our democracy a lot of the time. To an extent, you're seeing this on Ukraine. To an extent, you're seeing this on Ukraine. Supporting Ukraine hurts Western democracies. It benefits them strategically. It's a difficult balance. It's certainly a balance the Biden administration is thinking about. Um, you know, taking action on climate often is going to be democratically toxic. So we're in a world where the politician is going to have to balance this. And there are certain issues on which you have to admit that an argument has been lost. And you have to say, well, okay, we're not going to try to push that boulder up the hill. We're going to push others up other hills. And a good example is immigration, actually. Immigration is a generous and human rights respecting immigrations policy is utterly toxic for democracies. It makes us lose trust in our institutions collectively. But at the same time, it's what makes sense from any decent human rights point of view. So how do you balance this? And I'll be talking about that. But there are real conflicts like that. Okay, let's see. And so you can have a politician who will scare the life out of you in some respects. If you're used to your little camp where there's these 7-8 issues where you have to give them a tick. I'm hoping to make a video on the main channel building the politician that can both win and help democracy, what they're going to look like. We'll talk about that. Obviously, the big picture view will be they're going to be a somewhat populist institutionalist, which is a paradox. Now, if I've lost the capacity to scroll here, then I've lost all of the super thanks. I hope that's not true. Super thanks, super chats, whatever they're called. Let's have a look. Pavel. Hey Vlad, I was thinking that since the US and Russia used to be friends before the world wars, could it be nuclear weapons that are making us enemies? Like Russia is preventing Uh, Another Japan and hegemony. Okay. Um, okay. Um, Hi, Sylvia. Um, I think you could be going in several directions. Um, if nuclear escalation management wasn't part of the story with Ukraine, we could see potentially a very different outcome. I do think nuclear escalation management has been absolutely central to our Ukraine policy. Um, and I think, especially at the beginning, it was the main reason why the dosing happened as it happened, of weapons supplies to Ukraine. Now, at the same time, what's being proposed, an occupation of Russia, that would not go very well. It would be another catastrophic Western experiment in state building. Um, I can tell you that Belarus is closer to being a democracy if you just go like this to it and shake out the Lukashenko regime. Russia isn't. You're not naturally going to get a democracy. You're going to get a pluralistic dynamic of political conflict where 20% of the forces will be pro-democratic, which will be very good as long as there's competition and pluralism, and then on we go. Um, but I think that pluralism could occur within a much more democratic political environment than what Russia is currently doing. Um, your question could really go in so many different directions. I hope eventually we'll get to talk. We'll get to talk about those on other occasions. Um, but I do think, of course, nuclear escalation management has made a massive difference. Jasinin, hello, Vlad, once again. What's your thought on the future of the Balkans? We could do a talk about the Balkans separately. I think um, that would be better. But I'd only be really qualified to talk about how Russia sees some of the Balkan states. I would be trampling on other people's expertise um, if I talked deeply about Balkan countries the way I might talk about Britain, let's say. Um, mm, what I would say is that, and I'm sorry that you're going to be left with such a platitude here, but um, the all the friendly nations, all the Russia-friendly nations we have in Europe, are friends with Russia in virtue of kinds of marriages of convenience. These are not deep. These are not deep alliances. Um, and that includes everybody. Zonko, you often touch on topics and say something, yeah, but then we never come to it. I think that's a fault. I do have quite a plan on the content. We never come back to them. Do you have a plan for the content of the main channel? Yeah. So some of this is me just falling behind, but some of it is not. Some of it is a plan that is a slow plan because of my health, and I'm just releasing so few videos on the main channel. But when I say we'll talk about something on the main channel, you can basically expect that it'll happen. It's just going to be slow. Sometimes here I like to keep a little bit more of a coherence, um, and that means that I skip certain avenues that are well worth pursuing on other occasions. But as far as the main channel goes, everything I've ever said I'll talk about there, I'm planning to talk about there. So I have a clear idea of maybe ten important issues I want to discuss there. The trouble is that's a year at my rate of releasing content, and I'm exploring how to break that pattern. But I'm grateful you're pointing this out. William is saying, is there a number where the Russian citizens and oligarchs will rebel? Is Russia doomed? No country is doomed, not even North Korea. Um, no, Russians will not be rebelling because lots of Russian soldiers have been conscripted or injured or lost their lives. No, that's not going to happen. The only thing that could happen is that the regime could run aground. This is being talked about by a few experts right now. The regime could run aground in easy pickings. In other words, it's possible that there is a limit on the number of Russians the regime could pick up into send to the front, who are going to go easy um, with this predicament. That there's a speculation as to where that line is, where once the state reaches it, is exhausted itself out of people who are not going to say go to hell. I'm not doing this. Or at least they're going to want to say that, and they can still be sent to the front, but it's going to be harder to deal with them. So is there going to be a ceiling of that kind that they're going to hit? Is a conversation, and that way Putin will need to again politicize um, the society more, um, if he can. And but within the current context of depoliticization, there's this concern, positive concern, that there's a ceiling for Putin for easy pickings, and once he hits that, sending people to the front and gets harder for him. It gets much more politically challenging and risky. But in terms of the people who've lost their lives at the front, no. In fact, one thing that's played into this successfully for the regime is the lack of rotation of people. And it's allowed the depoliticized blob to kind of feel, well, now that these guys are gone, as long as there's not more scooping up happening, we can kind of live with this. Suzanne, thank you so much for being here. And sunflowers back your way. I love sunflowers, by the way. It's not so for me when I do sunflowers, it's not necessarily Ukraine. It's just I love sunflowers. Troyanda is saying a third world war. No. Uh, an interconnected set of global conflicts expressed in various ways in different parts of the world that you could perhaps at a stretch call a global war. The odds of avoiding a third world war very, very good. Now, that's not good enough for us, but they are very good. What we're seeing, however, is a set of increasingly interconnected conflicts. I mean, right? Look at what's happening right now in Israel, Gaza, and in the West Bank. Um, and then look at the protest, not the protest, the pogrom, anti Semitic mob running about in southern Russia. So there's a conflict in the Middle East, and then Putin's monopoly over organized violence begins to float to swim a little bit. So these interesting interconnections is what we're going to see more and more. And I roughly give the story really in the main channel video that we're going to have a set of actors playing a series of games and often playing several incompatible games within one and the same conflict. But Third World War, no. But by Third World War, I mean a strategic nuclear exchange. Black Hearts Rebels, thank you so much. Tommy. I suspect U.S. insufficient concern for Gazan casualties may be the biggest hit to their perceived moral authority since Iraq. In some parts of the world, but not in others. I do think that it's a problem for Biden, and some of the people who vote Biden are not going to be happy. But certainly, and the global South is not an actor; it's a plurality of different conflicting countries. But certainly, uh, mm, it is a hit for the West's capacity to make the argument to people who are unconvinced that it's about values at all. That makes it harder for the people who are on the bubble who could be convinced. So I think this is a very interesting topic worth talking about. Are there people who don't see a problem here? Sure. Are there hundreds of millions of people who see a problem that doesn't add up in their view? Yeah. And of course, that's a hit on US soft power. Elizabeth is asking thoughts on the timepiece. I only skimmed it, so I would need to tell you more detailed thoughts later. Mm, the political background against which to cast it is that privately, in the Western centers of power, the feeling is stalemate. What next? What next? What can we do here? And what's an exit strategy? In other words, an extrication from the situation. And then the problem comes back around. Well, there doesn't seem to be an extrication from this situation. The trouble is that some political leaders just don't get that there isn't an extrication from it. Others get it, and they know it's electorally prohibitive to keep sticking to the point that there isn't an extrication from this. So that's really the background against which you see this, and you should also expect the issue, and this is one of my not predictions but sort of observations. You should also expect the issue of corruption in Ukraine to be unfolded now with detail, often fake detail, but with detail in domestic political discourse, certainly in the United States. And that doesn't just mean, seems to be an issue with corruption in Ukraine, worth mentioning in the context of our support. Or indeed, there's an issue with corruption in Ukraine, and that's why I'm completely against helping Ukraine. It's that position. But the point is that this won't just be discussed in terms of corruption, not corruption, important, not important. There'll be specific corruption narratives introduced, and there'll be names being named as well, and scandals being framed, discussed, described. There's going to be obviously a lot of disinformation about this, but that's going to be one feature of U.S. domestic politics. Inevitably over the coming months. I suppose on top of this stalemate, there are then these three. There is several, if you like, themes of discourse swimming about. One says critical themes of discourse. One says we don't have an interest in this conflict. Another says we have an interest, but we can't win through on it. So what's the point? Let's not push it for an extra 10 kilometers gains for Ukraine. And the third is this is the narrative I mentioned. We don't know where our money is going. And you're not going to be able to sort of break through that argument by giving facts and figures. It's already it has political life of its own. So these are the three strands of the Ukraine critical position in the United States. Not our thing, but we can't win. So what's the point? And corruption, corruption, corruption. Um, which is an enormously powerful argument for domestic consumption when you've got much of the population feeling that the political establishment, quote unquote, is betraying them and deprioritizing them and prioritizing some outsiders, you know? So people feel, well, hang on. Hillary's telling us we need reprogramming, deprogramming, whatever Hillary said the other day about Trump voters. And then they're sending money to a foreign country we don't know anything about. So for us, it's deprogramming, and for some foreign country, it's money. Really? That's evil. That is an evil betrayal, right? So that argument sells really, really well. And it's going to be very difficult to hit these arguments. And the way to hit them, in my opinion, is with a conversation about strategy and an understanding of the intent of the Putin regime. You cannot sell in 2024 the Ukraine war to the American population as a foreign aid project. You have to sell it as a security project. And a special kind of security project by describing what the Putin regime is doing. But it's hard because the sort of description, for example, I give of the Putin project, which is regime security plus mystical escalation, that sounds like fear mongering. No, it's just another conflict. Eastern Europe, they've got a big empire there. It's misbehaving, but like, so what? Falling, empire falling apart, misbehaving, but so what? And the other thing that makes this argument hard is that Russia looks very weak now. So, on top of these 3 points, not our conflict, we can't win, even if it is our conflict, and we don't trust Ukraine. On top of that, there is also going to be, they don't scare us. And that's a fascinating bit of discourse too, because when Ukrainians say you are next, Americans say we're not. We're not. And that's a hard political challenge, because you see, I do have a we're next argument available a bit there in my analysis, but my analysis is based on the sorts of stuff that lots of people who know the Kremlin can say, but it doesn't sell very well. It certainly sells in the pro-Ukraine camp, right? But it doesn't sell very well politically, especially in the context of the exaggerations around Russiagate, right? Russia interfered in US domestic politics, but the interference was grossly exaggerated. It was real, and it was designed to disrupt US democracy, but it was exaggerated. And that's also another trauma there. So it's a very difficult hill to climb. The best thing that we can say on behalf of Ukraine now is that the United States is a sort of aircraft carrier policy-wise, and there isn't a tap there that can just be turned off. But certainly a Trump victory would be extremely bad news for Ukraine. Imam is asking, wow. Will the war continue so long as Putin is alive? If by alive we mean in the regime, as long as Putin is on top of that regime, he could conceivably, it's hard to imagine, could conceivably be not dead and not at the top of the regime. Um, yes, with the caveat of capacity. That's to say, I don't think Putin pulls out of this escalation um, except to regroup, take a break, start again. And what could happen is that while he regroups, he expires biologically or his regime collapses. So this is the story of a wider escalation against the West in 2030, let's say. Um, he might plan that, but capacity allowing, the wait might be longer than his regime allows. But short of that, the answer is basically no. Putin is still planning on a much bigger escalation than what he's done now. What he's done so far, despite the shocking bombings happening that we're not seeing as much, shocking bombings in Ukraine that we're not talking about as much because of the uh, uh, shocking pictures from the Middle East. Frederick, with the Russian phobia of foreign intervention, could the West's lack of an effective Russia policy and semi-effective weapon support be intentional to preclude any imminent Russian nuclear threat? Yeah, sure. The dosing of weapons to Ukraine is partly nuclear escalation management. But what we don't have, and I haven't made, oh, by the way, here is a main channel video. We have no Russia policy. Would you watch that? Because I keep mentioning it. So um, I keep mentioning it often in the context of Ukraine too. This business of politicizing the Russian space, something I think Ukraine is doing very poorly. Ukraine is able to insert little coins when conflicts appear on the Russian space. So it can. Ukraine's good at causing fragmentation as far as its capacities allow in the Russian space, but it's shockingly poor at causing politicization in the Russian space. It's understandable because when you're at war, you want to go like this. You don't want to say, we'll back these Russians against those Russians on balance because that's going to favor us and then blah, 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 blah. But we have to do it if Ukraine doesn't. Ukraine should too. But we have to do that and we don't have any Russian policy. Our policy is, oh, there's a Russian opposition. Say hi to them, maybe talk a bit about sanctions with them. We don't have a strategy for what to do with them. We don't have a discourse strategy for how to talk about a post-Putin future. If our democracies were really stable and if our leaders were leaders who were free to be leaders and had leadership skills, they would be talking vocally about a post-Putin future. They would be cultivating a situation where the issue of Putin losing power was far more politicized, and the issue of a post-Putin future was far more politicized, so that it would feel to not just the rest of the world, but to different groups in Russia, it would feel clear where the West would stand under different scenarios. Because you see, what's happened historically is that we've propped up the Putin regime. And that, of course, is massively dispiriting to an already radically depoliticized population. So, yeah, we're a depoliticized blob, but the West have been quasi corrupted by this global network called Putinism, and they have immersed themselves in ingratiation with it. So, what the hell are we supposed to do? We're going to protest? Well, we're going to be put in jail, and the West is just going to keep doing what it was doing. So, the, there's a complete lack of serious movement in these directions. And I've read some pretty so articles about how to politicize the Russian space, but I've loved them because they've been on the right topic, at least on the right agenda. Um, and that's political leadership. We're not doing that. Zonko, do we have to start facing the possibility that Putin will force his will by simply outlasting the West? Maybe this now becomes more a question of how we withdraw on the best terms. So, war is profoundly unpredictable. And, you know, I even have a video on the main channel about morale in the Russian army who says, what if they all collectively freak out with a catastrophic morale collapse? We don't know. And military experts can't know either, because what happens on the battlefield is profoundly interconnected with politics. So all kinds of stuff can happen, surprising stuff. But we can say, what does it look like we're on course for at the moment? And obviously, we're not on course for a Ukrainian victory. Ukrainian victory can happen, but we're not on course for it in two ways. That's not what's happening. That's not where we're moving now, number one. Number two, and of course it's not clear what we mean by Ukrainian victory, but let's say that halfway to that is pushing, let's say it's regaining all territory back to the 90s, right? Well, we're not on course for that. That could happen, but we're absolutely not on course for that. We're on course for a long, sticky conflict. And then if that happens, that wouldn't be a product of Western policy if Ukraine wins, at least regains all of its territory. It wouldn't. It's not the West's policy to get Ukraine into that position. So that's where we are. That's where we're heading now. We're heading into a more entrenched and consolidated version of where we are now. Now, throughout the history of this war, people on the chat channel especially have been really pissed off by my talking as though Ukraine's odds of getting Crimea are about 10%. But I think that was reasonable throughout as a bet. And I think that's probably where we are now. But 10% is high. You can get that. And of course, 10% is bullshit because it's uncertainty. It's not a percentage we can specify. That percentage is just a psychological clue that sets our expectations. But it's always been my sentiment. Sometimes I've spoken more aspirationally. But that's where we are. The trouble is, though, there isn't a deal. If you have a truthful understanding of what Putin is up to, there isn't a deal that makes sense for the West. And there's certainly not a deal that makes sense for Ukraine. So this is a very, very difficult, situation that we're in. And Putin's position is, well, I'm going to try to outlast them. And this can go in two directions. In a maximalist direction, where Putin outlasts us in Ukraine and then starts a provocation against NATO. And the other direction is just where Putin is nasty enough and patient enough for Ukraine to remain sovereign and independent, but not regain its territory and not join EU and NATO at all. That's completely possible. So on the current level of Western support and Western strategy, an amazing outcome for Ukraine would be to have the big part of Ukraine join EU and NATO. And even that's uncertain, right? Having said all this, it's completely possible for Ukraine to regain all of its territories because of the radical uncertainty of war and the uncertainty of untransparent regimes like the Putin regime, which can fold. But while there's a real chance of that, that chance is just not high from where we stand. So that's the story. My expertise comes in globally talking about the kind of world we live in, and maybe saying something in broad brushstrokes about the Kremlin strategy. And if you're asking me, is the Kremlin able to make a deal and stick to it? My analysis is no, it absolutely is not. A deal with Putin is an opportunity for him to recalibrate and behave worse later. That's it's not just that that's still my analysis, it's my analysis that that's Putin's position even more strongly than he ever was. So this business that he's got sort of escalation fatigue is not my analysis. So that's what I can give you. That's the situation we're in. A deal with Putin isn't gonna work. It doesn't last. But Ukraine is just not being put in a position, right, by Western policy, which says we are for not escalating the war and for Ukrainian survival, but not for Ukraine regaining Crimea. Let's say it's just not American policy that Ukraine regains Crimea, which means that if that happens, it'll be in virtue of a constellation of factors that are, if you like, as far as Western strategy is concerned, at least a bonus. So that's an enormously difficult picture. And what I said in the main channel video is that one thing to say about this is that Ukraine is tragically a victim of a world of enemies in certain respects, because different games are being played in this conflict by the United States. That is also, among other considerations, partly set on not absolutely weakening Russia. I can tell you just, I mean, I think you're all aware, but more than anybody in the world, really, you're all aware. But what the Ukrainian victory looks like on Ukrainian terms, um, mm, full territorial liberation, regime change in Russia, reparations, and trial for the Russian regime. Rain and Noel, thank you. Coming up to an hour. Are we good? Is an hour good? Hello, Lucas. But the theme I want to reemphasize, and this is really the original, this is really the bit that I'm afraid virtually nobody's talking about, and that is our crisis of global strategy. Why do we have half a Ukraine policy and a zero Russia policy in cartoonish terms? That is in large part a product of our weakness at home. And yeah, absolutely. Back to the questions we're dealing with in our chat. Um, um, that's absolutely a product of democratic weakness. And so, almost the biggest question of the age, if you don't put issues on the table like the climate crisis, but if you put in general a sort of a formula, is how do we deal with global issues in the international scene and form a strategy about all of that while our democracies are weak? How can we reconcile democratic decline with strategy, good strategy? And the answer is you can't. But you can make some progress. And one of the best things you can do is mitigate your democratic decline. It does wonders for your strategic capacity abroad. Um, I mentioned in the video in the main channel that I was watching this panel with 3 or 4 folks, including Neil Ferguson and Stephen Kotkin, and they were speculating about some speech that a president could make that'll implore people to act. And you can't do that if you don't have trust, sufficient bipartisan trust. So that's the difficult balance that we've got to start exploring. It's not just because politician XYZ is a moron and politician ABC is a moron too that we don't have a strategy. It's not an accident that we don't have a proper Ukraine strategy. In fact, our Ukraine strategy is actually better than many of our other strategies. It's because it's half present, it's half there. Our lack of Russia strategy. Our lack, our lack of Russia strategies. I mean, this is a telltale sign of our capacity. I mean, these beeps are threatening to do away with us and threatening to do big waves on England, and we don't have a policy on them. Ask the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak what's his Russia policy. He doesn't have, he doesn't have one. Oh my god. Normally, when you laugh like that, it means you've misunderstood something. You've caricatured something. But in this case, I haven't. It's genuinely true. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying the solutions are easy. They're not. I'm just saying the problem is stark. It's stark. And the problem is of that connection between us at home and strategy abroad. Um, I'm going to commit the cardinal sin now, Chris, and say that we can't. I can't give you the answer to how to reverse democratic decline at home, but I want to talk about how to do that. I think you can't, but I think you can make some partial reversals here and there. And I do think that it's about local politics. It's about thinking about how we make the internet more democratic. It's about constructive, taking constructive lessons from populism. It's about understanding that some of where we've got to has been produced by what came before. So this is the anti-Hillary Clinton position. That Trump is there in part because of Hillary style political projects. Not to bash on Hillary. I don't love bashing on Hillary because the whole world does enough of that. I missed a question. I missed a super thanks. Let me have a look. Super thanks, super chat. I don't know what any of these things are called. From Test Tracky, I think. Let me have a look. Yep. Was that the question about reversal? Yeah. Let's look at Paul's question. We'll come back and try to find your question. I've been hoping that Biden would explain why we need to help Ukraine in simple, direct language, not abstractions. It's hard though. Plus, Biden cannot make. Look at the speech he made for Hillary 8 years ago now. Biden can't do that now. I mean, you saw, we'll talk about Biden's cognitive state, which is genuinely a democratic concern. But you saw Biden in Israel with a notepad where he needed to look at things like, okay, bad things happened. Okay, sorry that really bad things happened with you. Now let's say something to cheer everybody up. Come on, America, Israel, you know the word, the thing. Yeah. And what's happening is that Biden is so accustomed to power that he most of the time just says, you know what, I am making good decisions in my view. I'm going to write this. Biden has been an effective deal maker, but he just think I'm going to write it. Me at 60% capacity, screw it. I can do it. Even though it looks like I can't speak. I can do it. Don't be put off the danger of talking about this by exploitation of the issue. Because the US voter is very scared about Biden's cognitive state. Very scared, including Democrats. So, for example, the kind of point I've just made that, and I'm somebody who couldn't speak for 2 or 3 years of my life, pretty much because of my neuroinflammation. I had severe ME, severe myalgic encephalomyelitis. So I know exactly what Biden is going through. And in my judgment, it's not affecting major decisions he's making. So, in other words, if you hate Biden's decisions, you hate his decisions. They're not a product of his cognitive decline. But everybody who is his opponent is arguing that he can't make decisions anymore. So this is a constructive conversation to have. But we'll have it. We'll have it separately. But he can't make a speech of any kind like that that'll inspire people. The best he can hope for is that the issue won't provoke too many enormous controversies and it can sort of roll on. That his position on Ukraine can sort of roll on without getting into too much trouble in the political discourse. So if Biden were Biden from 8 years ago, he could make that speech almost as well as anybody in American politics. But it wouldn't be received by enough people. It'd be received largely by people who already agree with him. That's the problem we're facing in our societies. So you can't discourse your way out of the sort of political crisis we face at home. You need to politic your way out of it and actually do policy to help us get our way, find our way a little bit out of it, even if we can't come out of it properly. But you see what I'm going with this? Speech makes one feel, oh, it's moral galvanization that solves it. But no, it's social forces that are conditioning the democratic decline. Moral galvanization constitutively can't happen when these forces are there. So you're going to be trying to, if you like, address a hall of people, an audience, trying to inspire them. Whereas in reality, you'll be standing in a quite different place without the auditorium there. You'll be standing in a market where people are not going to hear you. So that's the problem. So I do think good communication would help, Paul, but I think that moral galvanization is about 5 to 10% of the issue. Moral galvanization around democracy at home is 5 to 10% of the issue. Come on, we're America. And on Ukraine, that's also true, I'm afraid. Mark, when we say Russia's influence has been overblown, are we not looking in the wrong place? Did Russia not inject a near lethal dose of truth decay? No, it didn't. It absolutely didn't. It injected a microscopic dose of what we already had going. It injected nothing new at all. And you'll genuinely find experts, historians talking as though um, a third or half of the story behind our democratic decline is malign foreign interference. And that is ultimately terrifying. Ultimately terrifying as a thought. Because when you speak like that, you are producing the democratic decline. You are magical thinking your way out of reality, which is that this stuff is organic, this stuff is real. So, anyway, Russia's policy to only inject themselves into pre existing toxicities and conflicts. Um, so, what you're saying is profoundly not true and profoundly difficult to support factually. And no expert on active measures and various kinds of projects that Russian agencies engaged in gives them a high level of, attributes them a high level of competence or a high level of transformation. Um, so, but the problem is it's real and it happened. It's not just it happened, it's Russia's formal policy to undermine our democracies from inside by making us preoccupied with our own issues, making us drown in our own issues, making us toxicify in our own issues. So you're absolutely right in describing the policy, but it's terrifying to say, aren't it, isn't it mostly the Russians? It's absolutely terrifying. Absolutely terrifying because you're standing on a sinking boat. That's too scary. A listing boat, a boat that is taking on water, and you're blaming the birds and the fish for what's happening, when in fact you need to take some action to prevent it from sinking. So this is, I would say, in the West, this has reached a level of delusion that I would call it conspiracy theorizing. We had whatever her name is, Roseanne Barr, or whatever her name is, in one of the talk shows on YouTube the other day, saying that she thinks Trump is still president, and that Biden is not a real president. So we've got these absolutely deranged forms of magical thinking going on, but we on the on. I don't like to associate myself with political parties, and many of my views are contra to progressive narratives. I was about to say we're on the progressive side. Um, the progressive side, much of the aspirations of which I share, um, um, are deeply immersed in conspiracy thinking. Deeply immersed. We're thinking that it's baddies outside doing this, and then baddies at home who just malign irrational, horrible actors. And we're not taking any responsibility about what's produced this situation. How did we get to the 2010s? How did America get to the 2010s? What happened between, let's say, 1970 and 2010 that America got there? And there isn't any single answer there. It's a very complex story, but it's on us. So if you like, I don't want to give you a number of how I weigh it, but I know more about Russian interference than virtually anybody in this chat, probably more than anybody in this chat. I know more about how it works, short of the true experts in this area. So I'm not one to downplay it or one to ignore it, but I put it at a sort of um, uh, sort of icing on top of a cake bracket. It's us. It's us, and it'd be okay if we fully recognize that it's us, and then we said the icing is the Russians. Then we could sit around and say the Russians, the Russians, the Russians, the Russians. They are doing it again. The problem is the icing is the Russians. We are the cake, and we are saying the Russians, the Russians, the Russians. So I always knew that I would have a rant. I just didn't feel it would happen this time. Oh, there we go. How do we push back against democratic Tessie Tracky's question against democratic forces? Some of what I've just said is it. So breaking out of the damn conspiracy thinking that we're doing. We're doing this with Brexit in this country. I mean, nobody. I'm going to do a Trump here. Nobody is more against Brexit than me, but Remainers are doing a conspiracy thinking enterprise at the moment by saying that malign forces of foreign interference plus an outbreak of primordial irrationality produced this. No, that's not what produced it. Now, Brexit is in fact an incredibly incoherent project in England. It's a pro-globalization project for its instigators and an anti-globalization project for the people who are voting for it. So it's in itself it's a constitutively a kind of absurdity. But no, it's us, and I lost. As a British citizen, I lost. I take responsibility for that. And no, I didn't lose because the evil Russians did one over me. So very, very dangerous stuff that the center of politics is not taking responsibility for how we got into the situation we're in. But the multiple prongs are going to be local politics. They're going to be discourse. They're going to be robust defense of counter-majoritarian institutions and push back against the progressive tendencies to take over institutions ideologically. So I'll give a small. This is not the solution, but there's going to be a package of 20 things. But this is one I'm mentioning it. One of the things we've seen a lot recently is university bureaucracies beginning to act political. And you think it's nice because it's they say issues you might agree with, which is total terror, catastrophe. When my department, I'm not affiliated with an institution, but when my department or my university bureaucracy says we are with Israel or we are with people in Gaza or we are with trans people or we are with whatever, that is terrifying to me. And I don't mean it's really terrifying. It's not terrifying. It's just counterproductive. Whether it's my opinion or not. Because the way this works is it's only if Susan, Sarah, and Ricky on the corridor are free to speak as academics and express their view that this, but not the bureaucracy that it works. In other words, it's only if the university bureaucracy is politically silent that the university can be properly political, because Susan, Sarah, and Ricky can say, I am thinking about children in Gaza. It's only if the university bureaucracy doesn't say that they can say that. And so we've had a lot of this happen with higher education institutions. And that's not just an evil in itself. It's an evil that is currently producing an even bigger evil, which is a counter-revolutionary wave that is coming and not freeing universities of this ideological takeover, but inserting a worse ideological takeover, right? Mr. DeSantis in Florida is anti-woke, but his politics is not anti-woke. It's anti-freedom, anti-conservative, anti-counter-majoritarian institutions. So there's a counter-majoritarian, the counter-revolutionary, anti-democratic, authoritarian wave coming on top of us now, that in the higher education system is masquerading itself as anti-wokeness, which it isn't. But the wokeness is a problem too. as I've just described with the capture of university bureaucracies. Yeah, Frederick, I don't think our lack of policy is because we're scared of Russia. I don't think so. I think our lack of policy is about domestic incapacity. We're scared of Russia is about um, measuring weapons to Ukraine early on, but now we're going to be at 2 years at some point soon, and the lack of strategy isn't an outcome of nuclear escalation management. It's just not at all. There is nuclear escalation management that needs to be done, but the lack of strategy isn't produced by it. It's it's largely driven at home. Yes, I mean, Sebastian is saying workism is a gift to the right. I think a lot of progressive people don't believe workism exists. It's worth talking about it. Um, Partly because not enough is written about it that's good. There's another book by Yasha Monk out about it, but there are some things I would frame maybe historically very differently to where he says it. Um, Rachel, anti-woke is anti respect for Black culture in large part. Depends what you're talking about. As I say, there is the counter majoritarian there's the counter democratic authoritarian wave, and so if you like, much of what in politics is self-describing itself as anti-woke is in fact not anti-woke. It's authoritarian, scary stuff. But I'm anti-woke, like vehemently anti-woke. Wokeism is obstructing the climate movement catastrophically. It's obstructing center and left politics as well. And it's obstructing institutions from functioning properly. So, but the difference with me is that for me, that's compatible with saying profound things about um, racial injustice. It's that statement. I don't want to go into my views about race in the United States, but the view I've just described is compatible with not just recognizing racism in the United States, but recognizing its constitutive depth, which I do. So that's funny, right? Because there's also the story that the woke politics is precisely unconstructive at tackling these profound challenges we face. Um, uh, and I do have special views about how you need to use public good and solidarity as values you lean on to bring up bits of our society that are systemically deprioritized. So that's my view. I think we have profound deprioritization of many citizens. Profound deprioritization. So I'm absolutely not in the camp racism isn't a problem. But either way, um, we've now got this thing that I call a problem, and now we've got the counter reaction to it that's an even bigger problem. And that's a scary situation in which to be, because the original problem has no recognition of the dangers of the counter reaction, how to deal with it. It just is gonna give fuel to the counter reaction even more. And because of the centrist naivety and conspiratorial thought, we can't even recognize anti-democratic political forces in our society as properly being anti-democratic. We just call them bad or immoral or something else. We're not sharp on that. We're not sharp on which politics that is really different to mine that I don't want is anti-democratic, and which politics that I'm trying to beat, that I'm political opponent of, is not anti-democratic um, but just different to mine and not not mine. Um, so that's a really, really, really big. It's a really, really big blind spot we've got. We can't tell apart, for example, good from bad conservatives very easily, in the sense of pro-democratic versus anti-democratic conservatives. Um, so these are some of the problems that I'm raving around like a lunatic. Let's get ourselves to 1.5 hours. Folks are saying there's some politicians speaking better. Rokana sometimes does. He does sometimes, sometimes not. I mean, there's um, there's a lot of room for us just to talk about how politicians talk, and I think there's going to be problems all over. But I think there's real room for us to talk about how politicians should talk and how rapidly you could make, let us say, a 10% gain at putting people at ease just by saying the right things. Um, and that includes, in an age of polarization, saying things like, you don't trust me, but I've got you. You don't trust me, and you believe I might betray you, but I represent you. Um, that kind of discourse is very important. I'm trying. I don't know how. I don't. Um, I know it really doesn't look like that, and I feel what you feel. All of that is missing, and much else is missing. Um, let's end on a kind of a trivial remark. That's also not trivial because, of course, we are trying to politicize the Russian space. I often get requests, and I always don't do them, to address a Russian audience, um, of some Russians who, for example, might want to hear some thoughts about how to transcend imperialistic ways of looking at the world, and um, might do one of those at some point. But one of the remarkable things is how the Russian opposition, when Ukrainians are grossly unfair to it, react by pointing out how they're grossly unfair to it, which is profoundly and unbelievably passive and unconstructive. Um, and it's just, you can just get so far. I'll just give you an example. If all Russian opposition said this, and I'm not giving them advice, I'm giving us just food for thought about speech. But if all Russian opposition always said this, um, Ukraine's capacity to politicize the Russian space would increase. The politicization of the Russian space would increase, and we in the West would be more inspired about politicizing the Russian space. All they would need to say is, when Ukrainians basically demand that the Russian opposition just simply follows the line of Budanov, um, and just adopts the rules of Ukraine's information environment, which is utterly catastrophic for persuading any Russians that they should be anti-Putin. Um, or when Russian imperialists, for some things that they do benignly, are accused of being evil imperialists, which they might have imperialistic issues, but that's not always the problem. But let's say that they're told 7, 8 terribly unfair things by Ukrainians, and they say, "Well, we are not Ukrainian politicians, so go away." Well, this is so deeply unfair to us. We're victims here too. What you need to say is, of course, we're profoundly sorry for this war. We hear you, and we're working hard on making a difference. You, Russian opposition, are bad evildoers, and you're in some ways even worse than Mr. Putin. Ukrainian. Reply: we're so sorry for this brutal war, unacceptable brutal war. We hear you. We're working hard to change. Dramatic transformation. Literally, it's a 12-second script. I can't do it. Thank you, everybody. We're at 90 minutes. Dan, the man. Words can explain the gift you've given. Words can't explain the gift you've given me in the last 2 months. Stay well and continue the good work. Thank you so much, Dan. Means a lot. And thank you for tolerating my rants and rambles today, which hit important issues, but perhaps with a staccato format. Grateful. Thank you. And we're going to talk very soon. Lots and lots of love, everybody. Bye-bye for the moment. Amalfitano, thank you so much. I'm really grateful. Bye.